Welcome to Left Africa.
So picture this. It is June 10th, 2026. The president of global football is standing at this massive podium in Miami, right? He looks out at a room packed with international journalists, and he basically tells the entire world to just chill and relax.
Which is quite the statement to make on that specific day.
Oh, exactly. Because at that exact same moment, like 7,000 miles away on this dusty road in Mogadishu, Somalia, there is a referee being carried through the streets by this massive cheering crowd, and his historic career has just been effectively killed by a single passport stamp.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate collision. You have these borderless romantic ideals of international sports crashing headfirst into the very hard, very uncompromising reality of international geopolitics.
Right.
It's two completely different realities. They're tethered together by this one massive sporting event, but they are separated by this just unbridgeable gulf of global power.
And that collision, that huge gap, is exactly the focus of our deep dive today. The mission here is to explore this glaring contradiction for you. We have the marketing of the 2026 World Cup, which has been sold aggressively to you and the rest of the globe as the most, inclusive and expanded tournament in history.
Right, that was the whole pitch.
Exactly. But sitting right underneath all that shiny marketing is a geopolitical architecture that just shattered the dream of a literal history-making official. So, okay, let's unpack this. How does an institution that spends, hundreds of millions of dollars preaching global diversity end up with its own history-making referee locked out of the host country?
Well, the anatomy of this failure really begins with understanding the mechanics of how someone even reaches that elite level of officiating.
Mm-hmm.
And, who exactly was turned away here? Because Omar Artan, he is not just some random administrative official.
Right.
He is the first Somali FIFA-certified referee in history.
Which is huge. For a referee from a country like, say, England or Germany, the pipeline to a World Cup roster is essentially this highly calibrated state-funded machine.
Oh, absolutely.
You have continuous assessment from sports psychologists, you have dedicated training academies, and crucially, bureaucratic fast tracks for your travel. But Artan, he had none of that.
No, far from it. Somalia has spent the better part of 3 decades navigating conflict and basically rebuilding its civil infrastructure from the rubble.
Yeah.
There is no heavily funded national football league to act as a stable launch pad for him.
Right, so he's basically doing this on his own.
Exactly. Artan had to navigate an incredibly fragmented domestic system, prove his capability locally, and then somehow, against all odds, force his way onto the continental stage.
It's basically like climbing Mount Everest without any gear. The sheer determination required is just staggering. He had to prove his merit in the 2025 Africa Cup of Nations in Morocco, which, by the way, is an incredibly high-pressure, heavily scrutinized tournament.
It is intense.
Yeah.
And he did it. He passed that continental test with flying colors.
Yeah.
The dossier really highlights that his performance in Morocco is what earned him that coveted, highly exclusive spot on the 2026 World Cup officiating roster.
So he did everything right.
Every single thing. He checked every professional box that the governing body put in front of him. He earned the badge purely on raw, undeniable merit.
But then he hits the bureaucratic wall.
Yeah.
When he applied for his U.S. visa in May and June of 2026, he was denied. And there's no transparency, no opportunity for an appeal, just a hard rejection stamp.
What's fascinating here is the tension between that individual merit, everything he achieved on his own, and the hidden algorithms of the global travel system.
Right.
The dossier really dives into the mechanics of this visa denial, and they correlate it directly with the lingering infrastructure of U.S. travel policies that originally targeted Muslim-majority countries.
Wait, but even though the highly publicized 2017 travel ban was formally rescinded years ago?
Yes, on paper, the ban was rescinded by the Biden administration. But the Left Africa journalists point out that the bureaucratic machinery of that ban, so the extreme vetting protocols, the heightened algorithmic scrutiny, all that consular red tape, it never really vanished.
Wow.
If you carry a Somali passport, the system essentially defaults to treating you as a presumptive security risk based on your nationality alone.
Oh.
So Artan wasn't denied because of his personal background or, any specific action he took.
So it's just the passport.
Exactly. The dossier asserts he was caught in this digital net that heavily restricts movement from his region, completely regardless of his status as an elite FIFA-certified official.
And the timeline of what happens next is just brutal. So on June 9th, the New York Times publishes this major piece on Artan's story, bringing global attention to his dashed dream. And then the very next day, Juneteenth, FIFA officially drops him from the roster.
Yeah, the timing is striking.
It is, and the administrative logic is cold, but I guess it's simple. A referee who cannot legally enter the host countries cannot officiate the games, and that exact same day, Artan flies back home to Mogadishu.
But dropping him from the roster, that was only the bureaucratic reaction. The human reaction, the one unfolding on the ground in Mogadishu, that tells a completely different story.
Right, the scenes at the airport.
Yeah, both Reuters and the New York Times reported on his arrival. I mean,
Yeah.
Thousands of people lining the airport road, crowds surging forward, physically carrying him on their shoulders, waving national flags.
But why that specific reaction, though? I mean, he was returning having lost the very thing he set out to do. And, in many high-stakes sports cultures, returning without the prize is treated as a failure.
It really comes down to the psychological weight of the geopolitical system. The message from the Somali people, as analyzed by the dossier, was incredibly profound. By lifting him on their shoulders, they were collectively saying, the system failed you. You did not fail.
Oh, wow. That is powerful.
It is. They recognized that his exclusion was not a reflection of his competence on the pitch. It was a reflection of a global architecture that fundamentally excludes people holding their passport.
Right.
They celebrated him because he managed to climb high enough to force the rest of the world to look directly at that closed door.
Okay, but hold on. Let me push back here for a second. Isn't a sovereign nation entirely within its rights to enforce its own border security? I mean, the United States Homeland Security Department doesn't answer to a sports governing body.
Of course not.
It operates on its own intelligence and its own consular protocols. So why is the LeftAfrica dossier treating a sovereign U.S. immigration decision as FIFA's ultimate failure? So if the system failed him, how did the system's ultimate leader, FIFA, respond to losing their history-making referee? Surely they went to bat for him.
Well, that is the pivotal question. LeftAfrica doesn't dispute a nation's legal right to control its borders. What they are critiquing is FIFA's complicity and their selective use of massive global leverage.
Okay, I see.
Which brings us back to that split screen on Juneteenth. While Artan's being carried through the streets of Mogadishu, Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, is facing journalists in a press conference in Miami.
Right. And African journalists press him specifically on Artan's visa denial. And Infantino's response, which was captured by NBC, Euronews, and Sky Sports, was to tell fans and reporters to just chill.
Chill and relax. Those were his exact words.
Unbelievable.
And USA Today noted he added, trust FIFA, claiming that the organization had worked behind the scenes. But he offered absolutely no timeline, no evidence of what those efforts actually entailed, and zero explanation for why those supposedly robust behind-the-scenes efforts failed.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, where the bitter irony of the business model just jumps off the page. At that exact same press conference, Infantino was defending the rising costs of World Cup tickets.
Right, the expansion costs.
Yes. The governing body expanded this tournament to 48 teams, marketing it as this massive win for global representation. But expanding the tournament drastically increases operational costs, which are, of course, passed down to the fans.
Naturally.
So African fans, who are already facing some of the most expensive and logistically complex travel routes in history to reach a North American World Cup, are being told they need to pay significantly more for stadium access.
Right, they are basically funding the expansion.
Exactly. They are funding the expansion while simultaneously being told by the president of the organization to chill and relax when their own historic referee is locked out of the very stadiums they are paying premium prices to sit in.
It's quite the paradox.
Yeah.
And the dossier argues you really have to look closely at FIFA's historical track record to understand why this specific visa failure is so heavily scrutinized. You mentioned earlier about FIFA's global leverage.
Right.
When FIFA wants to change the rules of a host nation, they usually do.
Oh, absolutely. They rewrite tax codes. They demand dedicated untaxed lanes at airports for their corporate sponsors.
Yeah, let's look at a concrete mechanical example they bring up. In 2014, the World Cup was hosted in Brazil. At the time, Brazil actually had a federal law banning the sale of alcohol in football stadiums. It was a law put in place to curb violence.
Makes sense.
But FIFA's major sponsor was Budweiser. And the governing body didn't just ask nicely. They aggressively lobbied and essentially forced the Brazilian government to change its federal laws so they could sell beer in the stadiums.
Wait, they changed federal law for beer.
Yes, exactly.
So if an organization with that kind of unprecedented lobbying power, I mean, an organization led by a president making $3.9 million a year can force a sovereign nation to change its federal laws for a beer sponsor, how can they claim they were powerless to secure a single visa for one of their own top-tier officials?
Well, that is the brutal conclusion the dossier arrives at. Either FIFA didn't try hard enough because they didn't view an African referee as a priority worth burning political capital over, or their supposed global influence is highly, highly selective.
Yeah.
They are willing to battle host nations over commercial rights and corporate tax exemptions, but they will fold immediately when it comes to defending the actual human beings who make up the tournament, at least if it involves diplomatic friction with a major Western power.
Man. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really changes how you hear the word chill.
It really does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the LeftAfrica authors argue that chill is not a neutral word in this context at all. It is the language of privilege speaking directly to grievance.
Right.
When you tell a continent to chill about a systemic injustice, you are actively dismissing it as a minor inconvenience, like a diplomatic hiccup. You are signaling that you do not view their exclusion as a true crisis.
Right. It's totally dismissive.
Exactly. Infantino is looking at a policy that crushes a man's lifelong dream and telling the people who produced him to lower their voices and stop asking difficult questions.
And that brings us to the structural core of this entire investigation. The visa denial and the dismissive press conference aren't just isolated public relations disasters. They expose the deeper mechanisms of the 2026 tournament's entire marketing premise. Because the central selling point of this World Cup was inclusion.
It was sold globally as growing the game. The expansion from 32 teams to 48 teams was heavily marketed as the definitive moment the Global South would finally get its due on the world stage.
Well, let's look at the actual mechanics of that expansion, because the dossier breaks it down in a section called the numbers, and it's pretty stark.
Oh, yeah.
48. That is the new total number of teams in this expanded tournament. 10. That is the number of African teams, which is a record high. 3. The number of host nations, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. 1. The number of Somali referees denied entry to all 3 of those host nations. And 0. The number of official reasons given for that denial.
It really puts it into perspective. And, the expansion is a numerical reality out on the pitch. You will physically see more African players running on the grass. But the dossier points out this massive, unaddressed governance gap behind the scenes.
Right.
Because Africa provides 10 teams, a massive television audience, and a huge pipeline of global talent. But at the FIFA Council, which is the actual boardroom where the strategic power is held, where the revenue is divided, and where the real decisions are made,
right,
Africa still only holds 1/5 of the seats. Europe, meanwhile, holds 1/3.
It's like, think of the governing body like a massive multinational corporation, right? Africa is a subsidiary that is generating record engagement. They are providing the raw material for the product.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
But when you look at the holding company's board of directors, that subsidiary only holds non-voting shares, or just a tiny fraction of the equity. So they supply the labor and the aesthetics for the promotional flyer, but they absolutely do not dictate corporate policy.
Exactly. And this raises an important question, and it's really the central thesis LeftAfrica presents. If the underlying architecture of power hasn't fundamentally shifted, is expanding slots on the pitch anything more than just an optics upgrade?
Just a PR move.
Basically. FIFA is incredibly happy to market diversity to sell broadcasting rights to new regions, but they are entirely unwilling to actually share power or to fight for the substance of that inclusion when it requires confronting the hard borders of a host nation.
Yeah, they want the aesthetic of a global village, but it is managed by a boardroom of people who never have to worry about whether their own passport will be flagged by a customs algorithm.
Which is exactly why this situation with Omar Artan resonates so deeply. Every African official, every player, and every fan is watching this unfold.
Yeah, they see it.
And they are realizing that the expansion of the tournament masks the underlying reality of who is truly welcome in the global order. Because you can be the absolute best in your field, you can conquer a continent's sporting infrastructure, and you can still be treated as a presumptive security risk by the host nation.
So when we pull all of these threads together, what are we actually left with here? The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be the definitive moment the Global South got a real seat at the table. We were promised the celebration of borderless human achievement.
But that's not what happened.
No. Instead, we have this indelible image of Omar Artan back on a dusty road in Mogadishu with 0 World Cups to officiate, while the leadership of the sport sits in a climate-controlled press room and tells an entire continent to relax.
The grand promise of world football was tested at a customs desk, and the governing body simply blinked.
They blinked, and they moved right on to selling the next ticket. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today.
Yeah?
We are entering an era where border policies are becoming increasingly stringent, and visas are routinely used as geopolitical weapons. If the biggest, most lucrative, most powerful sporting event in the world can be effectively paralyzed by a single algorithmic customs check, what does the future hold for international events?
A huge question.
Are we heading toward a future where these massive global tournaments fracture into regional bubbles? Because if the World Cup can only be hosted in nations where a significant portion of the world isn't legally allowed to enter, we might be fundamentally destroying what it means to be a global event in the first place.